Hello, everyone. Welcome to another edition of Fired Up. My name is Morgan McLintic, and I am joined today by Ian Lipner.
Hello, and Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to you too, and Happy New Year, everyone. Today, we're going to be talking about PR measurement. We covered this topic all the way back in November 2023 with Richard Bagnall. He is one of the foremost inventors of the frameworks to measure PR. He's part of AMEC. Today, what we want to talk about is why PR measurement is broken for startups and why it's difficult, the common problems that you run into, and then how to fix them. Because you do need to measure it. We're big fans of measurement over here at Fired Up, but we are also big fans of practicality and efficiency. And the trouble with data is the more you have, the more questions you have. And are all those questions and gathering all that information, is it really driving your PR program forward? And sometimes it is, and sometimes they're vanity metrics or they're distractions. And we don't want that in startup marketing. So let's be practical and talk through it by that. And Ian has built PR messaging frameworks for multiple agencies, has a big background in this. So I'm excited to talk to you about this today.
Yeah, we spent a lot of time thinking about measurement in PR. It's harder than a lot of the other marketing disciplines, certainly harder than a lot of digital marketing. But I do think the arrival of digital marketing actually helped us along a little bit because it sort of provided a little bit more of a footing to go and say, hey, it's not just what we're saying and what we're sensing out there. You can see it in the clicks. At the same time, it also delivered this sort of expectation for clicks, right? And other call to actions being on our menu more. You know, it's sort of that dual sort of responsibility that we can't take all the credit for either way. But we have more ways of knowing whether the brand on the whole is getting its message across. To an extent, PR measurement has started to get a little bit, I don't know, it's trying to get a little bit finer than we're able to with the tools that we have.
Right. And just like attribution in digital marketing, there are tools to do it. It's good to sort of set the direction. They have a bunch of flaws. People's behavior is not linear anyway. We are not always rational. And so use them as a guideline. Don't get too obsessed with it. Make your program better and move on. All these things are not going to line up, and you can kind of go down into a rabbit hole where I think you get diminishing returns. Okay, so it's difficult, but why is it difficult? And when we talk about PR measurement here, I really think that we're talking about the measurement of media relations programs. We're not talking about influencer relations or measuring your awards program or your speaker. Those things tend to be fairly easy to sense. What we're talking about here is we try to get media coverage in these target publications in this quantity and saying these things. And did that have any impact? What was the business impact of this effort? And there's been various attempts to solve that, but it's really problematic, right? Because you cannot tell if somebody read this article and then how that changed their brand awareness or their brand equity, their perception of your company, or then their actions that they took after that, i.e., did they come to your website and do something positive like make a purchase? That correlation is very difficult to measure at a sort of fine-grained level, particularly for startups, because the volume of coverage that we're gathering for a startup, being a small company, is very different than a large-scale public consumer brand, for example. When you're looking through the lens of a smaller amount of coverage with a more complex B2B buying process, certainly that causation and that correlation is hard to prove.
Yeah.
So that's the nub of the problem.
Yeah, I mean, that's the crux of it. There's sort of two things going on there. It's just you've got not enough coverage to say, okay, let's make a measure. It'd be like counting sales of 4 and 6 and going, hey, we increased 50%. And so let's do it again next year. It can be finite. And it's hard to draw correlations between, your brand lift and one or two pieces of coverage. And then the other thing is we're talking about B2B products a lot. This isn't just go to the website and buy. Like maybe you can't even buy at the website, right? Like you can only start a buying process at the website for most B2B brands. So there's all of that research that people do independently that you don't see happening on your website. And you're not going to get the data directly. Think about how your own buyer journey for anything a little bit more complex. Let's say a car, right? Because you're not going to just go and buy one on the website, but you're going to do your research. You're going to hit a lot of different sources. Some of those will be earned. Some of them you might not even realize will be owned or paid, but you're not going to necessarily be signaling to your local dealer that you're ready till the very last minute, really, right? All those people making all that content for cars, they're getting you along there. And I know we're talking about startups, but when we think about how many different touches are required, the ability to string those together, I think, takes a little bit more than taking a look at one particular moment in that journey.
That's dead right. So to your example, editorial coverage is definitely part of that buyer journey. I read the review of hot hatchbacks in Car and Driver, and I liked the Golf, for example. Okay, but it's not the only thing that I do. So where does that come? First touch, last touch attribution. And the holy grail here is, if you could wave your magic wand, every publication, when you read an article, not just visit the whole website, but you read a specific article, little cookie on your page, and then it would know if that buyer then came within a particular look back window to your site and made a purchase. As long as the purchase is online, and in the car example, of course, you might be in the lot. It would be great if every publication provided that, but that's never going to happen, right? All the publications would then by default have to show granularly their visitor rates for each article and all the number of shares. Technically, I don't know whether it would be even possible. You run into all sorts of privacy problems as well. You can't get that correlation. Somebody read this article and then they did this thing on your website at all. The systems then try to get as near as they can to mimic that. So I don't know, just as Nielsen does with TV ratings, right? You say the same. They have a small number of people who they monitor to see what they're watching. And they say, okay, this is a snapshot. And we are going to then sort of ladder that up to be a proxy for the general population so that we can say broadly who's watched what. And you get people being part of a panel. These people read these articles and they also came to your website because you've signed up. I can kind of do that in a controlled way and sort of get to a proxy for it. But even there, it sort of breaks down for B2B and startups because within that cohort of the Nielsen panel, how many B2B buyers of a SaaS security tool are you really going to have? And is that going to be symbolic of all the buyers within that cohort? It's just not. And so they try to do it in that way and it breaks down. It can work if you're Tesla, right? Because you've got enough people buying a Tesla online, etc., and it's a brand of a big enough awareness, but it just can't work in a technical sense for B2B startups. There are a few that are trying to, okay, I'm going to work with a few publications to kind of get inside the publication and put my cookie on it. And again, that would be great, but it just won't scale to every trade publication, every newsletter that you want to be in, every podcast that you're going to appear on. That just is going to break down as you get more niche with a niche product, which is, let's face it, most B2B startups.
Yeah. I mean, look, the walled garden, so to speak, that's the offer that they're making toward advertisers is, hey, rely on my channel, rely on, let's take Meta's channels, and we'll give you as much data as you can get. Because a lot of people are just clicking on things within those channels, and they make that argument there. And that's damaging journalism because we don't have the heterogeneity and the local flavor and all that kind of stuff. I mean, that's a media war. Like you say, that's never going to happen, that we'll have that metric. Say, I hope not, because that would mean that there's some standard that would be driven by commerce that's more important than presenting the information to the public. That all said, that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to figure out, are we just spinning our wheels here? Because nobody wants to be spending their time, on what they think are good ideas that aren't necessarily driving buyers. Because we talk about this at Firebrand a lot. There's two sort of things that we have to find. We have to find what are the media interested in and what are the buyers interested in. And it's tricky to find the thing that they're both interested in, or the group of things that they're both interested in. And so we spend a lot of our time not necessarily on how did that one article drive a result, but more on how can we find those moments that are going to intersect and create an engaged audience, right? Whether some things are more media friendly and aren't really going to drive your buyer as much, but they're going to give you a chance to maybe get some buyer messages in there. This is why folks do surveys. Folks shine light on their philanthropy. It's not why they do it, but it's why they might shine light on other things that aren't driving buyer behavior. But at the same time, you have to have a way to say, hey, this is worthwhile. This is making an impact. And I think in the end, the difference between the excellent marketing teams and the teams that are just trying to understand what's going on are the ones that are making the changes based on what they're measuring and going, hey, here's content that is really helping us connect with this audience. And here's content that's connecting with this other audience, and not trying to create one thing that's going to try to do everything. And that, I think, it comes down to why we end up looking at how are these ideas performing in the channels that we don't earn.
That's right. And some of the tools out there will try to analyze the sentiment of the coverage that you have, because you want to get a certain volume of coverage in those target publications that Ian just mentioned. But you also want those to have a certain message and to be positive. And one of the other reasons why measurement is so broken is that those sentiment and analysis tools are just wrong. It'd be good to analyze positive and negative sentiment, but they just can't handle language correctly. And so when you actually read through the articles, it might have some fairly negative keywords in there and be graded as negative, but actually you read it and this article is fine, or it's flagging a particular weakness in your product. But this is a known weakness across all the products, and it's just a challenge. That doesn't mean that article is negative, just highlighting a challenge for the whole industry. So what that means in a practical sense is, if you want to do this kind of sentiment analysis for media coverage, you have to manually read and score all of the articles. And then that is a subjective thing, because a human is doing it. And often it's the PR team, whether that's an agency or whatever, who's assessing their own work. And so maybe they've got their thumb on the scale. How useful is this metric anyway once you come up with it? Because you broadly know whether your coverage is positive or negative. Or if it's negative and it really spreads and is widely read, but it's only one article, is that more impactful than, 100 other articles that were generally positive, but not very many people read? You just end up going down a sort of cycle of sort of caveats here and explanations. And I wonder whether that's a really useful metric. So sentiment analysis is a hard metric. It's a subjective metric, and it's not always a useful metric because people have their opinion about the sentiment of the coverage anyway, and the numbers are not going to prove it one way or another.
Yeah. I mean, the subjectivity of it makes it so hard. And it sort of gets into the general topic of like, how much time do you want to spend on measurement? And I always think about driving a car. Okay, I want to look at my odometer. I want to look at my speedometer, but I don't want you to charge me extra for it, right? And if I'm spending my eyes looking at that the whole time because it's such a thing that I have to report so often. Sometimes I feel like this when I'm on a long drive and they change the speed limit every 5 miles as you get go in and out of a town. You're like, you're not going to catch me. I'm paying attention. I'm spending more time looking at my speedometer than watching your road, but okay. That's what we're talking about. And so then you think about it in the context of a trip. What really matters to people? Did I get there? Right. And you're going to know that. Did I get there quickly? Did I get there safely? I don't know how that equates other than sentiment of safety, right? And quickly that gets into a whole nother conversation about how measurement is used and how expectations are set.
Right. But your point here is well made in that measurement takes time. And there's an opportunity cost of that time to collate the information and then do the assessment, etc. You absolutely should measure it, but it needs to be simple in a way that you can kind of quickly glance down at your speedo and not sit there trying to calculate, well, it's in miles, but I really need it to be in kilometers. So how am I going to do that? It needs to be quick. And so I think the general guidance has been that 10% of your budget should be spent on measurement. I think for startups, it's often less. When it becomes more, and why does it become more? Because you're doing share of voice and you're doing sentiment analysis and things that require manual assessment, then it can easily become 25%. And that means you're not getting to the end of the trip. You're running out of gas before you get there. That's, I think, one of the reasons why it's sort of broken. You should have a good sense of whether it's working or not. But if you're spending more than 10% of the budget on measurement, it's going to be broken and you're not going to get there. Okay, we know why it's broken. We know it's a challenge, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't measure things. So let's just talk a little bit about that. We talked earlier about AMEC, which is the International Association for the Measurement and Evaluation in Communications. They have a framework, the Integrated Evaluation Framework, which has 4 elements that you should measure, and they all begin with O. And the first one of those is the outputs. And those are the press releases and the blog posts and the things that you do. So those are measurable outputs. The second is the outtakes. So these are the articles and the shares of those articles and the sort of engagement with those articles that you get. The third are the outcomes. And now this is the impact on the audience. Did it change their brand perception? And the last one are the organizational impact. Did the business get revenue? Did people apply for jobs? What was the commercial impact? So they all begin with O: outputs, outtakes, outcomes, organizational impact. Most PR people are broadly familiar with this framework now and use some part of that approach when they're building a measurement system. Would you say, Ian?
A lot of agencies, a lot of PR teams like over-index just counting things, like counting articles. And then you get into the whole, are all articles created equal? Certainly not. And then we go from there. But I do think that it's difficult for a lot of PR teams and agencies to get all the way to like, hey, did we impact that outcome? Right. And not because we don't, but because we can't see through all of the different tools that are needed to get there, to our earlier conversation. And that isn't to say that there isn't more information to be found. That's one of the reasons that Firebrand does well to do multiple things for our clients, is because even if we're not doing the multiple things, we are, as an organization, fluent in them. We understand what questions to ask and go, okay, are you seeing more, I don't know, branded search happening? Are you seeing these other things that people might associate more with digital marketing that do correlate with what we're doing, right? And can we actually get those stats? And a lot of times PR teams don't or can't. When we're able to, then we can start to fill in and shade that picture a little bit, go from the stick figure to the more drawn out picture of what's happening. And some of those things you'll get from social teams, like you said, like when you hear, okay, people are sharing this, if people are sharing it, then more people are seeing it. And hey, on this date, this was shared. And hey, look at this on the traffic. We got 10, 15 new people that came in. We could talk about all the different parts of the funnel that are required thereafter, but you got them into the building, if you want to, use another metaphor. More and more organizations are starting to connect these things. And the best thing about working for startups is that we can make sure that they're doing it as early from the beginning on, so that we can learn all along the way and see that impact grow. And obviously those are the things that we do as we develop campaigns, is we're multi-channel campaigns that give you opportunities to measure.
Right. So what can PR realistically do? And what are the things that we can measure them? And how do we measure them? Here's how we like to think about it. And they broadly split between brand and demand, like a lot of marketing things. So on the brand side, the reputation side, you can measure brand awareness. Are your audiences aware of you? And you can measure brand equity. What do your audiences think of you? These are classic PR objectives. And so you measure brand awareness through opportunities to see, like, can they read so that might be articles in priority media. That might be the share of voice, which we'll talk about a bit more. It might be just some of these sort of easy to measure things like the number of followers that you have and the number of posts, views on posts, branded search volume that Ian just mentioned. Choose 3 to 5 of these as a sort of proxy for opportunities to see your brand. So brand awareness, opportunities to see, and then engagement. So did the content get likes? Did it get shares? Are you getting inbound media inquiries? Those sort of show, okay, my brand is becoming better known and people are taking a little bit of action around it. So brand awareness, I think, is the easiest one to measure. And there are lots of ways to do it. So you should absolutely measure that one. Brand equity, by which we mean like the sort of reputation, the perception, is harder, right? Isn't it, Ian? I mean, you're talking about tone, you're talking about message penetration. How do you measure that?
You're trying to figure out, hey, are we communicating a specific message? So if you think about that, if you're a startup, I think it might be reasonable to be able to just, okay, yes, this article, that we're going to get 25 of these if we have a great agency. You can go through those one by one and make sure that the messages that you're trying to get out there for that company are there. Normally, we've got 2 or 3 key things we want people to know about us. But, when you're working at scale, if it's for a larger brand, it starts to become a word bingo game a little bit, right? Okay, what are the phrases that I can use in searches to show that this is here? And while it might sound silly, it actually can help form a discipline among the people who are delivering the messaging. This is a phrase we're going to say every time in every interview because this gets our number one message through, right? And if you have a really engaged group and the people who are delivering that message understand how you're being measured as a group, you can actually get that to happen, right? Maybe it's you're communicating the speed of your product, right? And so any message that's around speed that gets in there can be, this is how you can save time when you're measuring. But you don't want to get it into a thing where, okay, all you got to do is say this word and we're doing the job here, right? You don't want to lose track of what are the attributes that you're trying to convey.
Right. I'm getting so obsessed with mentioning this special magic phrase because that's easy to track. You're sort of getting it back to front there. You're getting the measurement driving the messaging, and it should be the other way around, I think. But brand equity is really hard to measure. You're looking at, this is again the tone of how you're mentioned. This is the positive, negative, neutral in the articles. This is the message penetration. You have to read these things. So that's what you can do through the media, or you start taking surveys, right, of your target audience, doing primary research, or tacking into inbound inquiries. Where did you hear of us? You're trying to get a sense of what people think of your brand. You have to do that twice because you have to kind of get a baseline and then you have to think about how that changed. And there's going to be all sorts of marketing activities that impact that, not just PR. So then you end up with some kind of regression. Get rid of that. So brand equity, the reputation is hard. And I think for a lot of startups, they do this informally. I don't think many have a sort of formal, okay, every year or every 6 months, we go out and we take a brand awareness survey and are on unprompted mentions and associations with our brand I don't see a lot of startups doing that.
Well, it's hard to do. It's hard to execute, especially in small niches, right? Yeah, it is expensive to find those respondents who have time and know what you're talking about. But again, as brands scale, it becomes different. I do think the larger brands benefit from taking those snapshots in a lot of ways. You're not just asking, hey, what do you think of me? You're asking, well, what else is going on in your world, ideal customer, so that you can understand how to better relate to them. And that's sort of my message throughout this is like research and measurement are so that you can become better at marketing and better at understanding what the people want, what the people need, and hopefully getting to a point where you're creating the things that our world needs because you're listening well enough.
When it comes to brand awareness, brand equity, you can measure those. Now, then there's the sort of demand gen side of it. Often people are doing PR because they want customer acquisition, they want investment. We want to get in front of VCs, right? Or they want candidates. We want people to apply for jobs, and PR can support that by making us look like a great employer. Those are all much harder to measure. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. When you're sort of measuring customer acquisition, sometimes you have a product launch. There's not a lot of other marketing around it. It's not done at a show. So any inbound demand, you've sort of got an isolation test there where they've only read about it in the press. So you know that any uplift in traffic or any uplift in sales inquiries came directly from the PR effort. But you're really looking here about sort of website visits in correlation with your article in TechCrunch. We see this a lot. I mean, you especially see it with a launch from Stealth. Obviously, there's zero traffic and then there's some. What's the difference between that? It's the media around the launch. So you definitely see it around funding. Often we'll see traffic triple on the day, for example, and then go back to a higher norm. But you can see the referral traffic from an article. Now, it's very difficult to then know, okay, did that traffic really convert? Did these people come? What's the window for that? That gets higher. But in general, correlating when you started your PR effort, when there were particular milestone announcements with traffic to the site and branded search, the speed with which deals go through the funnel, buyers feel better about brands they are familiar with. And so you should see deal velocity accelerate as your PR efforts scale. Maybe you'll get some customers, prospects that say, I read about you in this article. I'm seeing you everywhere. Often we hear, from CEOs, they feel good about it because, hey, you guys seem to be everywhere. And you sort of get that sort of sense of surround sound from the media coverage. That's the kind of signal that you're looking for when it comes to customer acquisition, I think.
There's a lot of reference checking that you don't see. Your sales team might have done most of the heavy lifting with somebody. Maybe they don't know your brand that well, though. So they're like, what else does this brand do? What do they talk about? And there's this thing that I always talk about. Whenever you buy a new car, to get back to the cars, whenever you buy a new car, don't you notice that everybody seems to be driving your car right afterward, right? Like you become aware because you're keyed in on it and there's so many more signals to think about it. And your brain is just is paying closer attention. So if you've just read one of a longer article that you've dedicated your time to, I think that the ad catches your eye a little bit faster when you say, oh, that's that company I was reading about, or vice versa. Like I wasn't sure what that company did when I saw that billboard, but then I read this article and like I said, it colors in that picture more. And the moment that triggers action, it isn't the only moment. And I think we talk about this as beside the funnel impact, like things that are happening while the funnel is doing the major lifting, right? It's like, whoa, there it goes. Another mention. In the past, I've worked with clients that, for example, sell to the government. Government purchasing tends to be very period specific, right? And you'll hear on federal news radio, just all of a sudden, everybody's talking about aircraft, right? And you can feel these surges that are happening. That's what should be happening with PR too for those companies. There should be people doing more PR on those same subjects, running alongside these same programs so that you can have that surround sound effect that occurs when you're really connecting on all the channels.
Right. So that's customer acquisition. Another goal is often investment. And by investment, we're typically talking about VC investment, PE investment here, not investor relations for a public company. And look, how do you measure that? It's opportunities to see. So articles in particular, investor focused media, and then inbound inquiries from VCs based on an article. Now, you normally get this oddly once you've just had a transaction. So if you announce funding, the CEO and the CFO will get a bunch of inquiries from other VCs, not for this round, but maybe to sort of see if it's still open, but just to get on the dance card for the next round. And that's common and it's measurable. We often get asked, hey, we want to do PR so that we can get our first round of investment. And I have to say, I don't love that as a goal for a very small company because I don't know that PR is the best place to put your effort to try and secure that first round of funding. You should be using your network and other channels. It's unlikely that a media article is going to spark that first round of investment. It might support it. Hey, look, we've got some buzz. It's going to increase your valuation. I don't know that it sparks the first one. But once you've started announcing funding, it definitely, all right, we're getting coverage in PE publications or VC publications, again, sort of, VentureBeat, TechCrunch. That's going to drive other investor awareness. So that covers that one. The last one here in terms of goals and how you measure them is another one of these beside the funnel ones, Ian, when we're talking about candidates. We want to hire people. It's critical to our growth. How do you measure that?
Yeah, I mean, that can be job page visits correlated with some article about your best employer, those kinds of articles, or new employer trying to hire a bunch of people entering the area, those kinds of articles that appear in regional media or maybe, a national media thing that talks about your employee experience. And I also think it's sort of like the funnel, just like reducing the time to hire, right? Hey, this is a company that people are talking about. This is the hip company to work for right now. There's something inspiring about this leader at this company, this article I read. Those kinds of things can expedite that. And I think this metric is underutilized. Right now, the job market isn't so tight like it was a couple years ago. And people were talking about this more as a top goal of the PR program. But these are the people who make your organization what it is, and they drive revenue, the people that you hire. So this is a pathway to better profitable companies.
Yeah. Those awards, best places to work awards, those kind of coverage in media about what a great employee you are, definitely close a lot more offers. You're going to see, just like you do on sales, those metrics increase. So those are the sort of 5 areas: brand awareness, brand equity, customer acquisition, investment, candidate acquisition, that we like to measure. And then we talk about some criteria, choose 3 to 5 criteria to measure against each. And you're sort of really here benchmarking, I think, like a lot of PR measurement, benchmark yourself over time. It's good to have goals, milestones. I want to talk about that in a moment. But a lot of PR measurement is how are we doing over time? And Ian, we were talking before this. There's a sort of assumption, I think, in PR that every year you should get more coverage. And I have a lot of sympathy for that, right? It's an investment. You're building relationships with reporters. You should see returns from those investments. And it is true that companies that have invested in PR over years get far more coverage for an equivalent announcement than some who's coming in cold and no one knows who they are. So I do think we see that. But it's maybe wrong to think that every year or every quarter we're just going to get more media coverage than the last one because we invested in it before. I mean, investments go up and down, right?
Yeah, I mean, this leads to more problems, I think, for a lot of companies. Most companies aren't coming up with a giant new launch every year, let alone every quarter. And those are real moments that drive media interest. Of course, the challenge is to keep those valleys between those big moments up as high as possible. But comparing apples and oranges, it can be the problem with measurement in a year where you had a lot of sunshine and rain because there was a lot of hard news. Yeah, you're going to get more result. The year after that can be a very challenging year for a PR team, not just to equal the previous year, but to keep the energy up and to keep the ideas flowing and all those kinds of things. And typically, an even year would be considered a victory on the internal of a PR team. But from a client's point of view, like you said, we've been making this investment. You learned about us the first year, that you spent the first month asking us a billion questions. Didn't have to do that this year, right? Like those kinds of assumptions, I think it leads to like a belief that the PR firm isn't doing everything that they can or everything that they were the first year, right? Now, sometimes you have just additive success for the company that you get to narrate, and that momentum of the company's realities keep that ball rolling. And we've worked for excellent companies who've rolled all the way to giants because they're executing on all those points. But especially in the early years, there's going to be lulls. And if you change teams in the middle of that lull, because you think, wow, this is only 90% of what we got last year, you're going to start over with a lot of the basic sort of foundational work you have to do with your PR agency. Measurement should be used in those cases to go, okay, what of the things that we are doing as a team that don't rely upon hard news, how can we compare how we're doing there? And usually a good PR team is planning for that sort of challenge, right? And you're layering in more elements to your program that don't rely upon hard company news in order to focus more on that media interest and find the connection to the buyer media first.
Think about it as an investment. Sometimes your investments go up and sometimes, you need to keep sort of plowing the money in, dollar cost averaging, and over time it will pay off. But it is true that some quarters, some years even, you have more news, more going on than others. Sometimes companies, whole sectors are more mediagenic than others. Everyone's going down this year. If you were a Web3 company in the last few years, you didn't get a lot of interest, but in 2022, you got a ton, right? Does that mean you were doing a bad job? No, things are improving now maybe for you. It was just the interest in it. So we talk about this concept of message media fit. Is what you say of interest to the media? And you got to find that. Sometimes it's going to be a lot stronger than others, I would say. So as Ian said, just pass out. Are we getting the right amount of media? Are we performing well? Are we getting what we can? I think that's the thing to focus on. Now, this sort of links into the share of voice metric that we talked about earlier. What is share of voice? Share of voice is how much coverage did we get compared to our competitors and the sort of pool that we could have possibly got. And the idea is we want our share of voice to increase year on year. But normally we will fixate it on one or two competitors and we want to overtake those guys. Great, because startups are competitive. And why shouldn't the PR be competitive too? The reality is it does take some time then. You've got to track everybody's coverage, not just your own. What counts as a piece of coverage? What media, if they're a public company, they're going to get more than you. So you do end up with some factors here you need to take into consideration. Like if they are public, you can take out all their public stuff. But if they are a bigger organization, they're going to invest more in all of their marketing. So does that mean you're doing a poor job because you're spending a tenth of what they're spending? You can't go and compare yourself to where they were 5 years ago when they were your size. That doesn't work. It's relative effectiveness there that you've also got to take into consideration. And you tend to find with startups, they have one key announcement a year around their funding, let's say, and that drives a ton of coverage in that quarter. And then they go back to baseline. But you're tracking 5 or 6. Everyone's sort of having their little moment because they had their product announcement and their conference and their funding, and they changed their CEO and they got embroiled in a legal thing, and maybe someone was going to buy them. And we didn't have those things. Some of those were negative things. We're going to have our product launched next quarter. So you end up with a lot of sort of caveats on this. Maybe you need to look at over a year time frame. Share of voice is great, but I say sort of approach with caution, because it's easy to kind of go, yay, we should do this, but then you're really opening up a lot of work.
Look, I think every agency or PR team has 1 or 2 or 3 people who are great at creating the world's longest search strings so that they can eliminate garbage media, so that they can take out that CEO thing from that company that not our company, and try to get an apples to apples comparison. Because look, I agree. I think share of voice can be helpful as long as you're not setting the goal to, we will become #1 share of voice through our PR program. But looking at, here we're gaining on these bigger people, bigger brands, that they're much bigger, if you're going to include them in that share of voice comparison. And look, the pie is shrinking a little. We're helping move this along. But also, instead of focusing on like the share of voice of the entire ocean, create a little bit of a lake. We talk about priority share of voice, which is, let's look at the publications that are most relevant to our target audience, and let's measure the articles against like-sized competitors, or at least contextualized competitors that are relevant to our target audience. And let's use the tools that we have, because they're quick. And a lot of these tools, whether it's McLintic or Critical Mention or the others, they all have some way of counting clips and putting them into a pie graph for you, which, by the way, would have been a godsend 20 years ago, 10 years ago, and tilted at windmills trying to create some of these things. So it's easier to do it. And I think that's good in some ways, but it also means people go, okay, that means more, because that's one of the only things on the page. So again, it's got to be contextualized. Instead of setting specific targets for the world, pick some articles, pick the right competitors, and look for differences.
No discussion about PR measurement would be complete without talking about advertising value equivalency, AVE. Now, this is a concept that, hey, if I had bought these column inches originally in this publication at their rate for advertising, this is how much you would have paid. And back in the day, you would literally get a ruler out and measure how many column inches you got. And then you would multiply that number by another number, 3, because the sort of journalistic third-party value was worth more than the bias of just buying and slapping your ad in there. People read the articles, they don't read the ads in a newspaper necessarily. That was the concept, right? I love the idea of this. I remember us doing it back in the day. Oh, this is great because it makes us all feel wonderful. We've had this many column inches and I've timed it by a number 3, 5, and I've put a number on it.
The multipliers, you'd get to a new client, they'd be like, we only have a 1.25 multiplier. You'd be like, oh gosh. I mean,
this is rough. Yeah, this is rough. But it's just nonsense, right? Why is it nonsense? It's nonsense because no one pays the rate, because you say on the page, because they're fundamentally different processes. This multiplier is, should it be 3? Should it be 300? Should it be nothing? What are we talking about here? It's just drivel. It's been around since the 1950s, people. And it's time that it died. And there are still sort of little pockets of the world that are using this. But basically, you won't find it at this agency. And most modern agencies have thrown this one out.
Yeah, it's silly gymnastics that don't make you fitter.
Perfect. But you should set targets though, right, Ian? We talked about benchmarking. So, I think when you're thinking about setting targets, you're thinking about 3 things. Benchmarking, you're thinking about trends, and you're thinking about milestones. So let's just quickly touch on those 3.
First of all, you have to have sort of a way to know, what are we dealing with here? What was it like? What's the before picture? You're going to need to have a way to put that initial kind of data point stake in the sand to start on. Then you're going to need to actually say, okay, what sort of pace are we trying to improve things at? What do we think like we can execute at, and to what extent are we following along our pathway toward what will be essentially our objectives. And then the milestones are the things that will drive all of our KPIs higher because they're expected moments that we will achieve more attention.
Yeah. Yeah. Or just firsts. I like, a milestone being, hey, we're our first piece of art, coverage in this target publication, or our first front cover, or our first TV broadcast appearance. Milestones are another great way of sort of measuring, hey, are we moving forward? Are we competing? All right. So, Ian, thanks for your time breaking down why PR measurement is so hard, but it's still really, really important to do. And hopefully with these guidelines will help. We have actually got a whole guide, Startup's Guide to PR Measurement, that we've produced. It's not gated. You can just press the button and download it. It'll walk through a lot of this in detail. It's very targeted for startups because measuring for startups is really different than it is for major established brands. So we've tailored it exactly for that. That's our approach. And it also goes through what are all the definitions of all these metrics and the ones you should use for brand awareness or equity, etc. So take a look at that. We'll put it in the show notes, available on the site. Thanks for going on this PR measurement journey with us. Great to catch up with you, Ian. And next week, we will be talking about the grammar wars. So it's time for war, Ian.
Was that a semicolon or a comma?
We'll find out. So get your Oxford commas ready, and we'll see you next week.